So today I'm going to tie up a very popular fly. This is called the Clouser Deep Minnow. There are, I wouldn't say hundreds, but there are at least 40 or 50, maybe even more videos out there on the internet on tying the Clouser Deep Minnow. Similar to the woolly bugger, it is probably one of the most popular patterns ever invented in terms of modern day fly tying. Anyway, it's a very, very productive pattern. This particular one, I'm following the instructions in Bob Clouser's book, Clouser Flies. The reason for that, I've watched a number of videos where he's demonstrated it, as well as in that book. There are certain things that he does in tying this that he has certain reasons for. And actually, I think they work pretty well. So I will explain those a little bit in more detail. By all means, look at other videos out there. Find a methodology that you like, speaks to you, that works for you, and use it. I highly recommend you tie up some Clouser Deep Minnows because they're great patterns. Tying an orange and brown one particularly because a number of years ago we had a large fish kill in my area. We used to tie the chartreuse in white and yellow, and white was also very popular. Just had a great time with it, worked fantastic. After that fish kill, going to other streams that were only even 30 miles away, they just didn't produce. Ended up actually calling Bob Clouser and talking to him about it, and he recommended some other colors, and this was one of them. Point being is that streams that are even just a few miles apart, they may have, that watershed may have a little bit different forage fish base in it. Therefore, the fish key in on colors a little bit different. You could have different water clarity, different shade, different bottom structure, things like that. So whenever you're in a situation where one stream, one fly works great, remember in another one not too far away, it may not work that great. So tie these up in various color schemes. That's the Clouser Deep Minnow, and I'll get started. I'm going to start the Clouser Deep Minnow with my hook and a vise. This is a Mustad 3366 in a size 4. If you look in the book on Clouser Flies, you'll see that he has different recommendations for hooks, and as well as different recommendations for the corresponding dumbbell eyes and their size for the different hooks, just to give you some suggestions. I'm going to debarb that hook, and I'm going to attach my thread. For thread, I'm using a Danville 3/0 Monocord in an orange. And the reason is I want you to be able to see the thread and what it's doing in this fly. And I'll talk more about threads to use for the Clouser Deep Minnows, but it's more important for this that you actually see what's going on. Attach my thread, and I'm going to run my thread back to about the middle of the hook shank, maybe a little bit further back. Many people will tie their Clouser Deep Minnows with the dumbbell eyes real close to the eye of the hook. That's fine if they want to, and if they're catching fish with it, that's great. There's no right or wrong in this. Something to keep in mind, though, whenever you're adding weight to a fly, you're going to change the behavior of the fly in the water. You need to think about how you're changing it, and if that's the desirable change you're looking for. If the weight is too near the front, then the fly is going to, as you strip it, it's going to come up real quick and then drop down real quick, up real quick and down real quick. If you have the eyes further back, maybe even back to the end of the shank here, then because of the long body and everything, it's going to jerk up a little bit, but it will flutter down a little bit more. So it doesn't have the abrupt jig action, as more of a flutter or a darting action like this, like a wounded baitfish. But like I said, I'm tying this per the instructions in the Bob Clouser's book on Clouser Flies. And if you look at it, the dumbbell eyes are affixed just forward of the midpoint of the shank. So you'll notice that where I stop my thread back here, that's not where the dumbbell eyes are. They're just forward of that a little bit. Use your standard crisscross pattern to secure those dumbbells in. If you're too far forward, you can scooch these back a little, or you can scooch them forward. Make certain that they're wrapped in real well. And then we're going to do some wraps under the eyes and over the hook shank to pull all those crisscross wraps together in the middle. You'll end up with your thread just behind, maybe a wrap or two behind the eye of the hook. Now, it's not imperative that these are secured in 100% so that they don't move, that they're bulletproof, because as I'll talk in the end, towards the end of the video, you can, and most people will put some epoxy on front of this to help protect it, and that will anchor those eyes in. So with my thread just a wrap or two behind the eye of the hook, I'm going to tie in what is considered the belly. The belly, because of the dumbbell eyes, changes the center of gravity of the hook, and therefore it flips it over. Okay, so whatever's tied in down here is considered the belly. In this case, I'm going with an orange and a brown color combination. So I'm going to get maybe about a half a pencil of orange bucktail. I'm going to hold it near the tips, brushing out the short fibers here that I don't want, because I just want the nice tapered tips right here. You also don't want this to be too thick. That's just about right. You could go a little less than that. A lot of people will make the belly and the back too thick. I like the back to be almost twice as much as the belly, so therefore keep your belly a little bit sparser. Pull out any real short ones, get them all more or less close to the same length. You don't want to stack them, because in the water these will come down and you want that tapered look to it. I'm going to tie these in about 2.5 times the length of the hook. When I say the length of the hook, that's from the front of the barb to the bend of the hook. So measure that, and this is kind of a rough estimate. It doesn't have to be just perfect, but I like them just a little bit longer. Now here's a little trick for you when you're tying these in. A lot of people will put these right up on top, and as they're tying them in, see, it gets all pushed around like that, and then they're chasing it. Here's a little trick for you. Hold these fairly close to the tips. Get them at about a 45-degree angle on your side of the hook shank. You're going to get 1 and 2 wraps around, and those are just to collect them. I didn't pull on that tight. Okay, and what that's going to do, as you can see, it's holding it nice on your side of the hook, just like that. Okay, now, see, even the weight of the bobbin is wanting to pull that over a little bit. I'm going to redo this because I want to cut these ends so that they're nice and even. They got a little bit ragged there as I was demonstrating, but you're going to hold these at a 45, couple wraps to collect them, and now my left hand pinching that is going to pull the butt ends back just a little bit behind the eye of the hook. My next wrap brings it right on top of the hook. Couple of wraps down, not a lot, and I'll explain in just a second, but you don't want to wrap all the way down to the eyes. Then I'm going to come forward, touching wraps. I'm going to secure all that in. So you start out with it on this side of the hook, couple wraps, and as this hand pulls it back under the thread, just as it comes around top, put a few wraps on, but do not wrap any further than about halfway between the eye of the hook and the dumbbell eyes. My thread underneath, I'm going to reach underneath the dumbbell eyes and behind. Holding in my left hand the hair, I'm going to pull this down to the hook shank. I'm going to put in 3 wraps. That's 4. 3 wraps. Now I'm going to put in 3 open spiral wraps to the back here. 3 wraps. Notice that when I'm doing this, I'm holding the hair in an upward direction. I'm letting the thread pull it down to the hook shank. This keeps all of this hair on this side, the upper side of the hook shank. It doesn't go around or twist around or anything. With those 3 wraps in, I'll open spiral another 3 wraps back up behind the dumbbell eyes. Then I can let go of the belly. Now, I'm not going to reach up in front of the dumbbell eyes and start wrapping that in. That's a common, I don't want to say mistake, because it catches fish and people do it. But per the book, Bob Clouser thinks that this is important to have this little gap here. And more importantly, I think, is the abrupt slope. Because I think when this is turned over, it looks more like a bait fish with this, the belly sloping up to the nose than having a big wad of thread up there. Now I'm going to take my thread, I'm going to reach forward underneath, and I'm bringing this right behind the eye of the hook, but I'm using the hair, the butt ends of that hair, to hook that thread. So this might help. You're going to bring it from underneath right up behind the eye of the hook, and you're going to use the butt ends of that thread to just catch, the butt ends of the hair up front behind the eye of the hook to catch that thread. And this is going to help you to prevent you from wrapping right in front of those dumbbell eyes. Now, I'm going to leave my thread. Got to be careful of your thread wrap, especially with this 3/0. I'm going to leave my thread right behind the eye of the hook. Now I'm going to tie in the flash. Flash on this, I'm using 2 different kinds of flash. I'm using a orange Krystal flash and a brown holographic flashabou. So what I'm going to do is take about a half dozen strands of the orange. And there's different ways you can tie this in. I tend to favor the under the thread method like this. 2 things I'm doing here. I'm just leaving this hanging. These bits and pieces right here, as I drape them back, are on my side of the hook. I'm going to wrap in about 3 wraps, working down just a little bit, nice touching wraps, and leave that hanging. I'm then going to take another 4 or 5 strands of the flashabou. Same thing. I'm going to bring these up under the thread like this. I'm going to bring these ends onto my side of the hook shank, let the rest fall in front, and another 3 wraps downward. This will put me right about the end of the head space. I then take all of these strands, which is half of all of them, I bring them over to the far side of the hook and then also wrap those in. What this does for me is it divides them nice and even on both sides. But more importantly, for me actually, is it's a much easier way to tie those in than trying to just tie in the butt ends. Now there's different ways that people do that, but that's just one quick way of doing it, and you have the flash divided evenly on both sides. So with the flash all in, we're going to put in the back of the fly. For the back on this one, I'm using the brown Bucktail. And again, I want to tie in about twice as much brown as I did the orange. It's up to you. You could have it a little bit more subdued and have it the same amount, or just a little bit more. You can always, if you cut out, twice as much and you hold it up there and it's too much, you can always thin that out a little bit. You can always take some of that bucktail out. I'm going to tie this in the same length, maybe a little bit longer than the orange. So I'll cut off the excess. You could use a similar technique if you want. Just place them all down on top like I did here. Gently collect those down. I'm using my left hand to scooch them back just a little bit. You want to get a few wraps to secure them before you come up front. Then when you come up front, you don't want to try and wrap these in. Flash out of the way. You don't want to try and bind these butt ends in from this direction forward, because your thread's all going to fall off. You want to go right up behind the eye of the hook and start wrapping backwards, building up that space, and then slowly coming up to those butt ends to secure those in. There we go. Now, Looking at this now, the head got a little bit wider than I like. I like to keep it a little bit more of a gap between the front of the dumbbell eyes and the head, but my guess is that's because I got busy talking about it. I'm going to go ahead and put in a 5 or 6 turn whip finish. That's getting too close to the eye there. The other thing is I don't normally use a 3/0 thread for these. If it's say a size 1/0 or 2/0 hook, I might, but I don't normally use that heavy of a thread. Now, the Krystal flash and everything back here, I'm going to trim this, but I don't want to trim this straight off like this. About a 1/2 inch or so past the back of the bucktail. I just want to start trimming these and working my way backwards a little bit so that I have varying lengths. And the reason for that is, and I have seen this in the water, and it is definitely true, with these hanging off that bucktail a little bit as the current goes around the fly, it actually comes around all that hair and it eddies and swirls in the back. These flutter much more, and it looks like in the water, when this is just sitting there in a current, it actually looks like a tail in the back of that minnow that's, sitting there trying to wiggle and swim. So I'm going to put some head cement on all these thread wraps here and across that, even these thread wraps back here. And I would do this regardless of how I finish the head off, at least. So let me take this out here, turn it over, and show you how this is how it would normally ride. I get that brown bucktail on both sides there. So that is how the Clouser minnow rides actually in the water. It rides hook point up. Now, there's a couple of things I want to point out about this, and that is the thread that's used on this. I had initially used just the orange thread on this. You could use a brown thread if you want on that. It's up to you. I generally use a color that's going to match either the top or the bottom. However, I use the orange thread, as I mentioned, because I wanted you to be able to see just what the thread was doing. I thought if I used a brown thread, it wouldn't show up as well on video. So to me, it was more important that each step of the way you saw what the thread was doing. The other thing is that you could use a monofilament thread. Even Bob Clouser has mentioned this, and in his book he mentions it. The advantage of the monofilament is that the brown color and the orange color right here show through on the thread. So the color scheme, the brown on top and the orange on the belly, tend to come out to the nose a little bit further than they do with if you just use a solid color. I didn't use the monofilament because you wouldn't be able to see that on the screen, on the video, I should say, as well. So that's why I used the orange. So that's the first thing that I wanted to point out in terms of tying this. I generally would tie that with a monofilament. The other thing is that most people will go ahead and put epoxy all over this. Bob was a big proponent of the epoxy. When he first created this fly, you coat the eyes with epoxy, generally have a little bit coming down behind the dumbbell eyes, all around the front here. And on the upside, it usually goes maybe just in front of or right past, maybe halfway down those dumbbell eyes. What that does for you is it helps to protect these painted eyes so they last a little bit longer. It also will very much help to protect the hair between the dumbbell eyes right here. This thing is going to bounce along the bottom, and remember, this is how it swims, and when it does, these hairs are going to get beat up. And without it, they will start splitting in no time. So having some sort of protection on there is beneficial. I chose not to do it in this video because it does take a little bit more time. A 5-minute epoxy only takes about 5 minutes to set up, but I generally use a 30-minute epoxy. Different reasons why I do that. Plus the fact there's UV materials out there these days that a lot of people favor, but they have their pluses and minuses. So instead, I've opted to do a supplemental video soon on using epoxy in flies as well as the UV materials, pluses and minuses. So I foregone that. Decided not to, how's that, in this video, just for the sake of getting the video actually to, I guess, not be quite so long. So that is the Clouser Deep Minnow, the orange and brown version, lots of different color patterns. I suggest you take a look at the book Clouser Flies if you like a lot of warm water patterns. He's got some great stuff in there. There is the Clouser Deep Minnow. Thanks for watching today. Thanks for joining me at the Vise today. I hope you learned at least a new pattern, if not a new technique, maybe a tip or trick here and there. If you have any questions about this fly or any of the techniques used in constructing this pattern, please leave them in the comments section down below. If you go to the trouble to ask a question, I'll go to the trouble to answer it. If you'd like to help dressed irons, please share this video with your friends and anybody you think that might enjoy this pattern. Until next time, remember, it's fly tying. If you're not having fun, then you're doing it wrong.